Thank you for coming tonight. Before we get started, I just want to tell you about a couple upcoming events that we have scheduled. We have a busy month ahead of us. Next Tuesday night, which is the 11th at 6 p.m., we have amateur historian Jack Kelly coming, and he's going to be talking about Civil War soldiers from the Berwicks. So if you're interested in local history, you'll definitely want to come check that out. And then starting on Friday the 14th and running for 2 weeks, we have our book sale. So please visit us. We have a lot of books and DVDs for sale. And that takes place actually right here in this part of the library. And then we have a couple of fundraisers happening. We have on Tuesday the 25th at Flatbread Company in Portsmouth. It's a pizza place. If you order a pizza there after 4 p.m., then a portion of the proceeds will benefit our library, and we'll be there with a couple raffles as well, so we encourage you to stop by or order out. Everything benefits us. You don't need a special coupon or anything. And then we also have on Saturday, October 13th at 7 p.m., a special Bluegrass Concert with Southern Rail that's taking place at Noble High School. And tickets are $15, and we'll have those available very soon, so we hope you'll join us for that. And lastly, I also want to mention on Tuesday, October 2nd at 6 p.m., we're having a special author event with Susan Poulin, who you may know better as Ida. She plays Ida, a woman who runs with the Moose. She's a very funny comedian and author. So she'll be here to talk about her two books, The Sweet Life and Finding Your Inner Moose. Free event, and she is quite hilarious, so we encourage you to stop by. And I know it's a lot of information, so make sure you grab a Berwick newsletter on your way out. We had them at the circulation desk. Then, of course, tonight we're here to listen to Earl Brechlin, and he is an author, journalist, and Maine guide. He is a graduate of the University of Maine Forestry School and author of more than a dozen books, including The Adventure Guide to Maine. He has worked for nearly 40 years in Maine's newspaper industry and is a former Maine Journalist of the Year. And he is here today to talk about his book, Return to Moose River. So please welcome Earl Brechlin.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank all you folks for coming tonight. I want to thank Sharon for inviting me to come on down and talk a little bit about my book called Return to Moose River. And what we'd like to do is I'm going to read share some passages of the book with you, and then I have a slideshow about the spirits and some of the legends of Maine's North Woods and how they're all actually interconnected. And sort of the premise of the book is it starts out, the first essay is when we went back to the Moose River after 10 years after the first time we ran it. And after we ran it that first time, we said, we've got to do this every year. So the same group of friends and family have to do a trip like that. And we said we'd do the Moose every year, or every 10 years. So the first essay is 10 years later. Fathers have died, sons have been born. Life goes on. The river is metaphor for life. And then the final essay in the book is 10 years after the first essay, when we took my twin brother's ashes back there. And he was a big impetus for what we did. And a lot of these pictures, you may think you see me, but it's actually my twin brother. And when you see two of me, it may be my twin brother, me, or his son, who looks just like us too. So we're all born on the same day, as a matter of fact. So anyhow, and then we'll have some time for questions. So how many folks here have been on the Moose River, have been up on the Moose River? Okay, so we have some folks that have done that. And if you don't mind, I'm going to switch glasses, which is just part of the, comes with the territory after 30 years of running rivers, I guess. The Moose River rises from hardscrabble streams that flow down the mountains that line the border with Canada just west of Jackman, Maine. There are no towns here, just townships, and places marked on the map that used to be somewhere and home to somebody. Now there are little more than clusters of tumble-down cellar holes. In a place that measures time on a geologic scale, nearly 2 centuries of logging and erstwhile settlement have come and gone with barely a nod from the river. There are some 12.5 tributaries that contribute to the upper reaches of the Moose. As is convention in Maine, the repetitiveness of their names betrays a common sense approach to bestowing categorical individuality on watercourses that in most cases are indistinguishable. To set the record straight, there is no hierarchy or protocol on how such places are named. Some are brooks, some are streams, and some are called rivers, without any apparent correlation of size or reliability of flow. Tourists along the coast often mistakenly ask how long it takes for a smallest crab to grow into a lobster. Of course, they're totally separate beasts. Likewise, a stream is not a brook that has suddenly reached puberty. At some point, a person can easily cross any brook, stream, or river with just a single extended step. Conversely, at other points along their length, a bridge, boat, or canoe is the only way to get across safely. A quick look at that indispensable Bible of the outdoors in Maine, DeLorme's Maine Atlas and Gazetteer, shows that the east branch of Gulf Stream, the west branch of Gulf Stream, and Little Gulf Stream, that eventually formed naturally, just plain Gulf Stream, they flow into the Moose. The Moose itself has both an east branch and a west branch that form the south branch, where the water actually flows north. There is no north branch. Other brooks include Hogan, Bog, Boundary, Smart, and Smith. Another is simply called Number 1 Brook, which is not to be confused with nearby Number 6 Brook. Why some harried mapmaker decided to do away with brooks 2 through 5, which are nowhere to be found, is not entirely clear. The discounting of size when naming things manifests itself again when it comes to deciding whether a large standing body of water is either a pond or a lake. Most folks operate under the assumption that something you can skip across is a pond, skip a rock across is a pond. Anything larger is viewed as a lake. Not so in Maine. The only way to tell the size is by looking on a map. Duck Lake may be 100 feet across, while Duck Pond may be 1 mile long. The only agreement seems to be when calling something a flowage, though in this term for a wide, slow-moving part of the river also ignores size as criteria. It has been applied with equal regularity to wide, swampy places along a stream and to artificial lakes impounding thousands of acres of water. Of course, a flowage that looks like a lake may have just been a winding stream before that dam was built. Much like the way some Mainers like to give directions, it all depends deeply on your knowledge of what used to be someplace years ago. Naturally, no trace remains today. It matters not if you lived there all your life or just rolled into town yesterday. If you don't know how far to go past something that used to be there, be it house, farm, or store, or old oak tree, you're out of luck. Repetitiveness in place names runs rampant in a state that is nearly as big as the rest of New England combined. The Moose River watershed is quintessential in Maine in that it includes at least 1 mud pond, 1 clear pond, and 1 trout pond. All of Maine's river systems, including the mighty St. John, the Allagash, St. Croix, Penobscot, Androscoggin, and Kennebec, into which the Moose River flows after a detour through Moosehead Lake, have at least one of each of those. In total, Maine has 65 mud ponds, 46 long ponds, 37 bog brooks, 32 round ponds. Terrestrial landmarks don't escape this onslaught of geographic redundancy. There are 22 ram islands, 19 bald mountains, and half a dozen or so places called Black Point. There are 18 moose ponds, 8 moose brooks, and 7 moose islands. Curiously, just as many as there are mouse islands. But there is only 1 Moose River. This next passage, one of the things I'd like to focus on in the book is that when we go to these wild places, we follow in the footsteps of many other people, be it Native Americans, loggers, river drivers, settlers, farmers. And so I like to share a lot of the history of those places and some of the larger-than-life characters. And this next section is about the ranger at Chimney Pond in Baxter State Park Campground, which is a hiking trail. It's about 4 miles and 1,500 feet up from the road. From the campground on the north side of Chimney Pond, the far shore appears to be a pleasant and welcoming place. In the alluvial fan created by the outwash of the stream that drains the head wall, there are several flat, grassy areas where moose often can be spotted grazing with calves in the evening. The water itself is sharply crystalline and unquestionably cold. In June, when snowfields linger on the heights, much of it was literally frozen just hours before. With a maximum depth at best of 6 feet, the pond is believed to freeze solid in the winter. Ranger Greg Hamer likes to tell of a hiker who stopped at Chimney Pond Cabin one day, an aluminum tube holding a fly rod protruding from his day pack. He asked if fishing was permitted. Ranger Hamer replied that it was. The man then spent the morning casting from various points around the pond, trying all manner of flies and nymphs, netting, nary, and nibble. As he was leaving, the fisherman, his ego perhaps bruised by the poor showing, stopped again at the ranger station. He offered that he didn't think there were any fish in Chimney Pond. And with a classic air of understatement, Ranger Hamer replied, "There aren't." "Why didn't you tell me that 4 hours ago?" the fisherman asked. Ranger Hamer said, "You asked me if you could fish, not if there were any fish." Ranger Hamer said, "I asked him if he hadn't just spent a glorious morning in one of the prettiest places on earth doing something he absolutely loved." Ranger Hamer related later, he said yes and admitted it was kind of hard to be upset about that. One of the things on the trips, when you go with a large group, it's seldom a wilderness experience. That many people just make a lot of noise. And so you often don't, especially if you're in the last canoe in the line, you don't often see a lot of wildlife. And this is from a trip that we did on the west branch of the Penobscot River. On this expedition, I'm one of a party of 12 that I would soon come to lament includes a couple of free agents who believe that standard operating procedure in wilderness travel requires inordinate amounts of yelling. Within the first hour on river, there are repeated shouts of rock, as if the possibility of boulders lurking just below the surface on any river in Maine is somehow some kind of epiphany. In the court of law, opposing counsel will just stipulate to the fact that those paddling canoes will encounter all manner of submerged obstacles, be they rocks, logs, or even a kissing cousin of the Loch Ness Monster. But here we're apparently going to litigate each and every complaint. There's also shouting from the shore up the riverbank to camp. Have any of you guys seen my life jacket? From one side of camp to the other. Anyone have any extra TP? Along with the expected bursts of unimaginative profanity when a tent has the audacity not to set itself up correctly, or a king-size can of beer experiences an in-flight malfunction, unabashedly discharging its frothy contents into a sealed river bag full of clothing. The only thing that yelling guarantees is that you won't see any wildlife. The sound of an excitable human voice is the animal kingdom's equivalent of Paul Revere riding into Lexington warning, "The morons are coming." Anything with the ability to flee or hide will, not as much out of a sense of mortal danger as a desire to avoid exposure to a gratuitous banality. Perhaps it's an ability to comprehend all that open space, a disquiet when surrounded by nature's delicious disorganization that engenders a subconscious need in some people to turn up the volume. Maybe there's an instinctual craving to carve out one's personal space with noise when confronted with a vastness not constrained by walls or fences, or traversed by well-trodden paths or obvious beginnings and ends. When I'm in the woods, I want to feel nature's embrace, not slap her in the face. The ideal method of communication out here is not a shout, it's a whisper. I'm here to listen, not repeatedly proclaim my arrival, with all the pomp and pageantry of the Sergeant of Arms of the State of the Union announcing the entrance of the President. One of our trips was on the west branch of the Penobscot River, and we found we were just a few days away from being exactly about 130 years since Thoreau had done the river. And he wrote his 3 trips to Maine were put together as a book called In the Maine Woods. They were 3 long essays that he had done from 3 different trips to Maine. And I kept kind of looking for Thoreau's spirit. Where was I going to find it on this trip, and what could I see that he might have seen? And it was kind of rainy and drizzly and really foggy, except for the last evening on the river. Alone on the shore, I watch as the first slim crescent of the sun drifts below the overcast. The light becomes full vertical, scratching the tattered bottoms of the clouds, the entire landscape now bathed in a warm, intense yellow radiance that pours like honey from the sky. I watch transfixed as the almost alien glow invigorates a proud, patient landscape, object admittedly of many insults, but which has never fully capitulated to the affronts of axe or plow or chainsaw. Knowing such sorcery will only last for a few more minutes, I race back up the path to camp to summon the other members of the group. Engrossed in their playing cards, their cheddar, their cigars, and their Canadian club, the artificial glare of the Coleman lantern erasing lengthening shadows, they're less than enthusiastic to drop everything and come down to the shore just to see the sunset. "You heard the guide," Carl finally says sarcastically, plopping the deck of cards on the table. "Let's go check it out." Single file, they tromp down the trail and fan out across the sand, shoulder to shoulder, their faces painted in the rich golden palette, islands of light stark against the still black clouds overhead. "Look at it, it's incredible. Have you ever seen light like that?" I ask. Only the wind whispering through the waving beach grass breaks the silence. It's clear they're only humoring me, if only to ensure that strawberry shortcake remains on the menu for the next trip. After the obligatory minute of feigned interest, Carl removes the stub of a cigar from his lips and uses it to punctuate the air. He says with exaggerated sincerity, "You can't buy light like that." And finally, I'm going to share a couple passages from that last trip when we took his ashes. And it was funny, Roxy and my wife Roxy was sitting here in the front row. She and I were up doing a talk in Carrabassett a couple of weeks ago, and we rode the narrow gauge train in Phillips. And the only other couple on the train owns a sporting camp on the Moose River, right where we scattered my brother's ashes. So it's kind of fun how things come together. When you paddle on the Moose River, you're never alone. You never know what you're going to see when the bow of your canoe noses around one of the many serpentine bends in the 25-mile stretch below Holub Pond, all the way down to Addian Lake. After a while, the terrain seems to blur together. It's a repetitious yet varied combination of graveled banks, muddy alders, and the occasional boulder. Atop the banks and upland areas, a towering wall of spruce and fir line the edge, with the random tall white pine standing guard. Here and there are dead-still backwaters that tempt the adventurous with the hollow lure that one day a jaunt up one of these unnamed meandering marshes might at long last lead to something more interesting than just another red-winged blackbird and a difficult place to turn the canoe around. Signs of civilization are few and far between, just a seldom-used cabin or two along the way. In the distance, sitting high on Number 5 Mountain, is an abandoned fire tower lookout. It's a distinct landmark, but due to the meandering nature of the Moose, one that is worthless for keeping your bearings. On some stretches of the river, when you're trending to the southeast, the tower rises dead ahead in the distance. For a while, it's well off to river right. Later in the day, it sits dead ahead again, although a check of the compass reveals that stretch of the river runs due southwest. Fortunately, there's only one way to go, downstream. Going with the current always gets you where you're going eventually. The highlight of any trip on the Moose, naturally, is when you swing around a bend and spot a moose. Despite the river's name, there's no guarantee they will appear on cue. You can paddle the Moose one year and stop counting after seeing 30 or more. Go back another time, particularly during hunting season, and you'll see nary a one. Most often, when you see a moose on a lake, it's just a spot in the distance, barely distinguishable from all the boulders and other detritus that clog the shores. When you see one on the Moose River, however, it's right there, front and center, usually backside too, barely 10 yards away. Moose don't have particularly good eyesight. Their ears and noses take up the slack. On any river or stream, there's always a subtle draft of air just above it moving along with the current. By facing downstream, moose can see any danger in that direction and detect the scent of any predators approaching from behind. The moose, for the most part, are much more nonplussed about these chance encounters. The natural human reaction upon seeing one, particularly for the first time, is to yell moose, as if the folks in the canoe right behind you somehow failed to see 1,200 pounds of wet hair and antlers standing knee-deep in the stream right in front of them. Providing you don't get too close or yell too loud, the moose will just give you a sideways glance and go back about its business. When it does amble off, it's usually at a reserved pace, akin to antique collectors at yard sales, making a beeline to a prized find they just spotted, yet careful not to transmit any depth of interest through intensity and pace of their movement. Moose aren't the only year-round residents. There are also otters and raccoons, beavers and woodchucks, water birds of every description, and even the occasional black bear. Yet there are other inhabitants too, one seldom glimpsed, their presence more often sensed than seen. You see, the Moose River is also home to ghosts. No, they aren't the cinematic specters that cause blood to ooze from the walls of old houses or lurk beneath beds to frighten small children at bedtime. They are the echoes of the Native American, woodsmen, river drivers, blacksmiths, camp cooks, trappers, and farmers who traveled this very same route in centuries past. And on this, the moose has no monopoly. These spirits are everywhere in the wilds of Maine. The Great North Woods is among the few places left to experience exactly the same thing others did 100 or even 200 years ago. A canoe is much more than a way to get from point A to B. It's also a poor man's time machine. The wind in the pines, the thump of a drumming spruce grouse in the distance, the cry of a pileated woodpecker, and the scolding call of a kingfisher playing leapfrog as you paddle along, all transcend time and mortality. Faces sunburned from the glare of sun off flat water, quivering muscles well into their 15th mile of paddling, and the smell of wood smoke drifting through the low slanting rays of the sun at supper are not the province of any one era. For those attuned to them, the spirits of Maine's wilderness aren't difficult to find. They hover just above chill mist in the rapids. They tend abandoned fields that long ago surrendered to the verdant tide of forest succession. By night, they linger in the flickering shadows, drawn to the primal warmth of a generous campfire. Eyebrows raised, they take measure of all interlopers, looking to confirm sincere reverence for the land, true love of the water, and abiding respect for the wildlife. Voyagers who fail to show proper deference to those who came before will never truly know these wild places. They ignore them at their own peril. Those who scoff at the notion betray a deliberate ignorance, affirmation of a life unchallenged, an intellect empty of curiosity, resigned to only see as far as the next wave while adrift on a boundless, churning sea. And finally, the last passage that I'd like to share with you is my thoughts right after we put Carl's ashes out in the river. In moments of doubt, I question the wisdom of leaving him there. Some see wilderness as a place of loneliness. For those who find diversion only in the artificial and contrived, that just may be true. But those who seek not just natural beauty, but also the essence and spirits of the wild will never walk or paddle alone. There is no grave, no stone to mark Carl's existence on earth. There is no place for those who love him to gather and make a pilgrimage to. No fixed place to mourn. The coins will keep his memory alive, but it is the epitome of hubris to think that those two ultimately will be anything other than a finite and ephemeral effort. As hundreds of abandoned cemeteries in New England prove, even a well-appointed plot and stalwart granite marker are no ticket to eternity. There is nothing sadder than an untended grave. Forlorn stones stand as silent witness to an innate desire to eke out some sliver of immortality. Once the spirit is fled and the body gone to dust, all that really remains are echoes in the hearts and the spirits of those we touched, those we loved, those who loved us. Our contribution to the contents of their characters and that which they pass on is the only true monument to our existence. Physically, we live on again for a time in sons and daughters with their father's eyes and their mother's dispositions, but that too fades. Obituaries are published, funerals held, stone carved, but in the end, only the fleeting essence of fragile memory remains, destined to evaporate upon the dilution and dispersal of generations. Nothing, too, about a river remains fixed and unyielding. Permanence alone resides in the ceaseless flow, always there, always moving, the rhythm of April flood and August drought. an endless and unbroken cycle. Channels shift, banks erode, landmarks disappear. Ghosts of Indians, loggers, farmers, campers, and paddlers, the very water itself, call to anxious spirits not ready to move on. Follow me. So that concludes the reading portion. And I'm just going to cue up the slides here, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the great legends in Maine's outdoors. So far, the technology's been working great. Put that there. And if all goes according to plan, I can control it with the phone. So. Okay, so as I mentioned with the book, we jumped ahead. The wilds of Maine just aren't about rocks and trees, and that's one of the things that I've been trying to talk to folks when I've been going around the state. Is we've done a wonderful job conserving land, conserving water, but what are we doing to preserve the cultural history? The spirits of those people that came before. When Roxy and I have been going around the state, the Stanley Museum, even the Wilhelm Reich Museum, the Sandy River Railroad, all these places, the Logging Museum in Patton, they're all volunteers, small town folks trying to save all of this. That's as much a part of the heritage as the land, because I believe the land is, and people aren't separable in Maine. The people are the land is the people. So, as I said, when you hike and when you paddle, you're never alone. So a lot of things are interconnected and have connections to myself, and I use Mount Desert Island in Bar Harbor because that's where we live as kind of the circle for that. But the first person I wanted to talk about is Shepherd Bodie and the magic of Telos. Now Telos Lake is way up above Baxter, way up above Millinocket, and it's the headwaters of the Allagash. Well, in 1839, Shepherd Bodie went up to Telos Lake because all of the timber being cut up in that region was being sent down the Allagash, down the St. John. It was all owned by people in Bangor, and they had to pay a tax when it went down the river through Canada. And they hated paying that tax. So they sent him up there, undoubtedly with Native Americans that knew the lay of the land and how the streams and the rivers, and he realized that if they built a dam just 11 feet high on Chamberlain Lake, they could make all the water flow backwards into Telos and down an unused channel and come out in the Penobscot River and send all the wood to Bangor instead. So he went up there, and there were 700 square miles of timber now that could go, didn't have to pay Canadian duty. So Shepherd Bodie was the surveyor that went up there, figured that all out, and the state of Maine chartered a company to build a dam on Telos. Then they had to cut this channel down through, and the river actually had gone that way probably 10,000 years before. And they didn't have any heavy equipment, they didn't have blasting powders and things of that nature. So what they did is they built another dam at the end of Telos, let the water get really high, about 40 feet high, and then they broke the dam and let the flood cut the channel. And you can't imagine the mess that all sent downstream, but this was 1839 and people weren't too worried about that. That was just a few years after Maine had become a state. So one of the great things now about Telos is there's a dam there, and the dam on Chamberlain is from that one lake with a portage of no more than 1.5 miles with your canoe. You can go to the Allagash and St. John, you can go to the East Branch, you can go to the West Branch, or you can go to the Kennebec River, all from that one lake. So it's a pretty remarkable place. Now, Shepherd Bodie didn't get a lot of acknowledgement for that. You think they would have named a mountain or a lake or something for him, and all he ever got was, there's a brook right there on the Atlas and Gate called Bodie Brook. There's a campsite because it's part of Baxter State Park. And he also did a lot of other engineering in Maine, but you wouldn't know it unless you knew something about what happened. The irony about that dam was the state didn't give the people who owned the timber the license to build the dam. They gave another group of businessmen, and when they finally got it all built and started sending the logs, they charged a tax for every log that went through it. It wasn't as much as the Canadians were charging, but they were still paying a tax. Henry David Thoreau, he, as I said before, he did his three trips that he did to Maine. His first one was to Katahdin in 1846. He didn't make it all the way to the top of the mountain. He lost his Native American guide. He spent the night in the fog on the mountain by himself with no tent, no blanket or anything. It's inspired him to write that mountains are the great unfinished places of the world. On his second trip to Maine in 1853, he went through the T-Loss Cut because he was able to get down through there now because that was all there and ready to go. So those three books, those three essays that he wrote from those three trips became the Maine Woods. Now Thoreau's guide, what people don't realize with Thoreau, everybody knows about Walden and he went to live deliberately. He was a bit of a mama's boy. He built this cabin on land that was owned by Ralph Waldo Emerson and to write this book called Walden. But 5 out of 7 nights a week, he walked the railroad tracks home and had dinner at his mother's house. So he wasn't just growing beans and had a few chickens. He was kind of playing at it a little bit. And anyway, when he came to Maine, he certainly wasn't the great outdoorsman. And he was guided by 2 Native American guides, Joe Polis and Joseph Addian. They were Penobscots. At Thoreau's funeral, which Emerson gave the eulogy, he said that Thoreau was only impressed by 3 men in his life. Abolitionist John Brown of Harper's Ferry fame, Walt Whitman, and Joe Polis. So he actually credited one of his guides for that. And Thoreau died in 1862, and his last 2 words, separated by a pause, were moose and Indian. Those were his last words. Polis went on to represent his tribe in Augusta and went down to Washington, D.C. and was called upon by Daniel Webster. So he was a large figure in Maine history. And of course, John Brown raided the arsenal at Harper's Ferry and the immortal song that we still know. And with irony is my brother passed away on a Moose River trip with a bunch of guys, and we were tubing on the Potomac and could see the arsenal from where he passed away. So there's a little bit of a tie-in there too. Frederick Church is one of the famous Hudson River School artists. He was a student of Thomas Cole, and who first came to Maine in 1850, and he went to Mount Desert Island, and later he went up to the Millinocket area, and this is one of his famous paintings of Katahdin from Millinocket Lake. And it was his paintings. Back then we didn't have social media and they didn't have color magazines, but those paintings that were done in Maine would circulate through all the large cities, and that inspired all the rusticators and settlers that came up to Mount Desert Island and to places like Millinocket and got the sporting camp thing going in Maine. So he's got some really wonderful paintings. Maine's first registered Maine guide is a woman. A lot of people know about Fly Rod Crosby by now, but some people don't. When Maine decided to start registering guides, she got license number 1. And I think that was pretty incredible, thinking that in late 1800s, the way society was at the time. She did a lot to promote Maine. She went to these outdoor shows in Boston and New York. They set up a trout pond with trout in it where people could fish. They built an actual log cabin, and she would talk about the virtues. The railroads funded all of this, and then would get people to come up and go to Rangeley or go to Moosehead or Kineo or these types of places. She was a bit of an environmental disaster actually herself. She caught 300 trout in a day at Middle Dam up at Moose Lake, McGuntick Lake, which nowadays you would just be horrified that someone took that many fish at once. And she had the dubious distinction of shooting the last caribou in Maine. So she shot the very last caribou, and they've never come back since. But that was all legal then. But among the many sports that she met there and encouraged to come to Maine was Teddy Roosevelt. And he would one day be president, of course, and go on to create 5 different national parks. So Roosevelt, he did a little hiking on Mount Desert Island, but mostly he spent time up around Katahdin. And he was guided by 2 guys, much like Thoreau, a gentleman named Bill Sewell and Wilmot Dow. And he never did ride a moose. That's actual early Photoshop, and that's what I put there. they had a picture of a moose and they had a picture of Roosevelt riding a horse, so they cut it apart and put it together. He went on to found the Bull Moose Party, and which he was elected under that banner. But he climbed Katahdin in 1879 on a path laid out by Bodie and used by Frederick Church. So they all walked in the same footsteps. Of course, Baxter State Park was created by Percival Baxter, who was governor of Maine, and he tried to convince the legislature to buy that land and create it into a state park, and they wouldn't do it. And so he did it with his own money and assembled a park that today is over 220,000 acres. It's a marvelous place. Percival Baxter met Teddy Roosevelt at a convention of conservationists in Portland, Maine. So they had a connection there too. And Percival Baxter's saying, which is on a plaque at the base of Katahdin, is that man is born to die, his works are short-lived, buildings crumble, monuments decay, and wealth vanishes, but Katahdin in all its glory forever shall remain the mountain of the people of Maine. Now, one of the first things Baxter did was hire Leroy Dudley to be a ranger. And he was reportedly hired not so much to take care of people on trails or do that, but they had a severe poaching problem in the park because they didn't allow hunting. And the report when they decided to hire Dudley was, quote, he knew all the poachers' tricks. So I think he may have been known some poachers himself. Leroy Dudley climbed Katahdin more than 500 times. He based out of Chimney. He married his wife Abby at the summit. He blazed trails, catered to sports, and was rumored to personally know Pomola, the fearsome Native American god that was said to reside on Katahdin, and that's why Native Americans would not go up there, because they believed they would be stricken down by this deity. And he also, they had a campground that could accommodate 30 people at Chimney Pond. When it was full, that was too many people for him. And he would sneak off to the other side of the pond where he had a cave, and he would live. And one of the essays in the book was, we went in search of Dudley's cave, and we actually found it where he used to stay. The irony is that for all those times he was on the mountain and all the people he helped, he died when he was hit by a logging truck in 1942. And he's buried on a hillside not far from there with a beautiful view of Mount Katahdin. Don Fenler, I don't know how many folks know the legend of Don Fenler, the Lost on a Mountain in Maine, a book that many, many children in Maine read every year. He was 12 years old and disappeared on top of Katahdin while he was hiking with Boy Scouts and with his twin brother. And they had search parties, and for nine days they looked for him and they could not find him anywhere. At the end of those 9 days, he appeared out of the woods, naked, without shoes, and covered with bug bites and scratches. The place where, as the newspapers at the time, and I love this expression, was given up by the woods, was called Lunksoos Camp, where Governor Baxter made his first ascent of Katahdin and became inspired to protect the area. It was a place visited by Frederick Church, and as well as Thoreau had stayed there. So there's all those tights. It's all now part of Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. And I had a great fortune years ago as a journalist to interview Don Fenler, which was one of the thrills of my career because he's such a legend. Among the folks that Dudley befriended over the years was an artist from Damariscotta, Maine called Maurice Jake Day. And he drew that picture of it's kind of looks a little cuddly compared to the way the Native Americans pictured it, of Pomola. And he used to tell these stories about the gods, which were collected by visitors and later became a book. And the irony is the proceeds from the sale of that book with Jake Day's illustration on the front were used to pay for the headstone of Katahdin red granite that's now over Leroy Dudley's grave. And Day joined a group called Jake's Rangers, and then for a while he went to live in Southern California, where he became an illustrator for Walt Disney Studios. Now, believe it or not, Walt Disney wanted to make Bambi a mule deer, and Jake Day would have nothing of it, and convinced Walt Disney that it needed to be a white-tailed deer from Maine. So Disney sent back to Maine, and they procured 2 fawns, which they named Bandy and Faline, and they were sent from Maine to California so they could make the drawings. And then Disney paid Jake Day and other artists to spend 6 months at Katahdin doing all the preliminary sketches and background scenes for Bambi. So when you watch the movie Bambi, that's actually Baxter State Park in Maine. And a lot of people don't know that. I always thought that was kind of cool. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, and anybody who's following the news today, they're fighting out another justice down in Washington as we speak, sought out the company of Jake's Rangers. He toured all the natural areas all over the country, and that's a picture of the justice looking up at Katahdin, and that was taken by Jake Day. He was an early through hiker of the Appalachian Trail, and Justice Douglas was also a key proponent of restoring the C&L Canal Park, which parallels the Potomac River, at Harper's Ferry, which goes back to John Brown and all of that. So there's some ties there. And then Don Fendler, not long after Douglas was confirmed, Don Fendler received a medal from President Franklin Roosevelt. So there's a little bit of Franklin Roosevelt connection, which we'll talk about it a little more in a minute, and Don Fendler. So the Appalachian Trail in Maine, which is, there's about 230 some odd miles, I guess, of the Appalachian Trail in Maine. The idea for the trail came from one of the founders of the Wilderness Society in 1921. Bob Marshall, Aldo Leopold, pitched the idea of the trail in a newspaper article. The original idea had the trail actually ending on top of Mount Washington, not on top of Mount Katahdin. The trail was conceived, and they started to fight about trying to lay it out. And McKay tried to enlist Franklin Roosevelt when he was chairman of the Park Committee in New York, but Franklin Roosevelt actually fought the trail and didn't want it to go through New York. But, eventually it was built. Roosevelt was outvoted, and the headquarters of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and the National Park Office that now oversees it is in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. So originally I said the trail was going to end on Mount Washington. A good friend of McKay was a man from Maine named Myron Avery, who was born and brought up in Lubec. And he convinced McKay to bring the trail to Maine and to have it end on top of Katahdin. Avery ended up supervising the entire construction of the Appalachian Trail from Georgia all the way to Maine. And Avery was the first to walk its entire distance with a measuring wheel to get the actual distance on it. And the Appalachian Trail is not a cake run or a sidewalk now, but believe me, back then it was a lot rougher than it is now, although it included a lot more stretches of road. And but Avery did the whole thing. And Bill Bryson, who was an author that wrote, among other things, A Walk in the Woods, said it really was Avery's trail. And so a man from Maine is really responsible for it. And the quote from Bryson, which I really love, he said, Avery mapped it out, bullied and cajoled clubs into producing volunteer crews, and personally superintended the construction of hundreds of miles of path. He extended its length of 1,200 miles to well over 2,000. And before it was finished, he walked every inch of it. In under 7 years, using volunteer labor, he built a 2,000-mile trail through mountain wilderness. Armies have done less. When you think about the Appalachian Trail, there's some larger-than-life figures that have hiked that. Earl Shafer was the first person to through hike without taking a couple weeks off or taking months off or doing section. And he wrote a book called Walking Through Spring, Georgia to Maine. In 1948 is when he did that, and his trail name was Crazy One. People on the trail adopt these trail names, and Wallflower or Bambi, I don't know what people get them, but a lot of folks use them. It took him 124 days to walk from Georgia to Maine. In 1965, he did it in the opposite direction, and it only took him 99 days. And in 1965, he did it in 99 days. In 1998, at the age of 79, he hiked north again and took 174 days. So he did it that many times. This is one of my favorite figures of Maine outdoor lore, Grandma Gatewood. She was the first female through hiker in 1955, and she did it at age 67. She wore sneakers, she carried everything in a duffel bag, used a shower curtain for a tent, and had an army blanket for a sleeping bag. She did it again in 1960 And at age 75 in 1963, she did it a third time. Her favorite trail food was Vienna sausages, those little cans of sausages. And she didn't suffer fools lightly. The quote that she was most often reprinted in the newspapers today was, "Most people today are panty waists," is what she said. Bill Irwin and his dog Orient, he was the first blind thru hiker who did it in 1990 with his dog. It took him 9 months. He wasn't allowed to bring the dog into Baxter State Park because they don't allow dogs, even service animals. But the park did assign a ranger to escort him. They've lightened up since then. There was recently a blind person that climbed Katahdin that they allowed that. He got to the top of Katahdin and dropped to his knees and sang Amazing Grace. He was a man who'd had several failed marriages. He had a lot of troubles in his life, problems with alcohol, and he wrote a book called Blind Courage, and later on, Amazing Grace. He estimated in his hike he fell more than 1,000 times. He ended up marrying a girl from Maine, and then, ironically, lived in a house near Monson with a great view of Katahdin, which he could not see. Mount Desert Island's Barefoot Sisters were larger-than-life characters on the trail. They did the entire distance in 2000 barefoot, without any shoes. What happened was a couple sections they hit snow, so they wore shoes, but then went back and did it once the snow melted. So they hiked it twice, first from Maine to Georgia, then they turned around, didn't know what else they were going to do, so they hiked back to Maine. So they did it in twice. They wrote 2 books, Southbound and then Walking Home. And I've actually got to interview them. They said once their feet toughened up, they didn't have problems with cuts and it didn't hurt. But their feet looked almost like horse hooves by the time they were done. Now, Myron Avery's Mount Desert Island connection, we had mentioned, Bob Avery, Myron Avery earlier, who made the trail come to Maine. They ended up naming Avery Peak in the Bigelow Preserve for him for all he did to lay out the trail and all he did for trails in Maine. But his son, Robert, lived in Bar Harbor and became the head of the Bar Harbor Banking and Trust later on. He's passed on now. But it's just, and I knew Bob Avery very well, and I didn't realize until after he passed away that he was the son of Myron Avery, who had so much trail history, and I kind of regret that because I think it would have been a really great discussion. So long before he did his paintings, the Katahdin Frederick Church came to Mount Desert Island, and his work, inspired by the essays that he read that Thoreau had done, and facilitated by the paths laid out by Will Bodie, inspired those people to come to Maine. George Dorr, who went on to found Acadia National Park, climbed Katahdin and was with a U.S. representative from Maine at the time who worked with Teddy Roosevelt to try to get a national park created in Maine. Dorr was also friends with Governor Baxter, although they held opposing views. Governor Baxter was horrified at the idea that Katahdin might become a national park and that a big hotel might get built there and those types of things. Although Dorr did advocate for a 1 million acre park in northern Maine to be named for Teddy Roosevelt. So anyway, the basic is the landscape is not just us and it's not just rocks and trees, it's a combination. And when we visit these places, we're strengthened and renewed, and in return we leave a little bit of our spirit for those who will one day follow us. And that's my presentation. I didn't know if you had any questions, or as George Mitchell usually says, speeches disguised as questions, or if you want to share some of your adventures. Yes?
Yeah, why didn't Roosevelt want the park?
He didn't see the value of a park in Maine. He was more interested in the parks out west, and which is unfortunate. Now we have a national park and we have a national monument, so I guess hindsight's always 20/20 in that respect. So, other questions? I heard somebody talking before they'd done a trip on the Moose River with some friends. Was that you that was talking about that? You went up to the Moose River before? No. Okay. You were. Did you see some moose?
We did, but not until the very last day. It was a long weekend, and muddy footprints along the banks. And one couple got up about an hour before the rest of us, around 5 o'clock, and they saw him every day. The last day of the trip, we got up about that early, and we saw him, and then we saw him wallowing in that lake. Is it Atian or Adian?
Adian Pond, right.
We put in Jackman.
Yep.
And had 3 or 4 days there. It was fun.
It's a nice trip because if you do it the honest way, which is you start in the first lake and then you portage into the second and then you come back to the first. And my preference is just to drive around and put in at the second lake and just go back and get the car later.
This was pretty calm water in like July or August or something like that.
We actually tried to come out of the Moose River one time and the wind was howling out of the northwest. And we came out of the mouth of the river and got just so far, and then the wind blew us back up the mouth of the river in the canoes. And I was paddling with a 9-year-old in my bow, one of my nephews, and 2 adults could make a little bit of progress, but we couldn't make any progress whatsoever. So we finally got over into the lee of an island that we found there, and we cut down some maple saplings that were a couple 3 inches in diameter, and we took all 6 canoes and we made 3 catamarans out of them. We named them Moose Tiki because it looked a little bit like Thor Heyerdahl would use. And with 4 people in each of those boats, you could make some headway against the big waves. And we finally got across the lake and were able to do it. But yeah, it's beautiful when it's flat. And then some of the slides there show you when it's flat. But when it's windy, it can be a bear.
There was a portage of about 1/4 mile. We had probably way too much stuff, so several trips back and forth.
I say that in the book. I said we always bring way too much stuff, and when you get to do a portage, the East Branch of the Penobscot River, the river guide actually says this is a trip for masochistic portageers because there's so many portages and so many big waterfalls, and none of these waterfalls are marked. And we did it when the river was almost in flood, and if you go around the wrong corner, and it's too late to turn back, and one of the falls is almost 40 feet, so you want to kind of edge down and peek around the corners, and you can usually hear the falls well before you see them, but you end up swimming once in a while. Yes, sir.
Saw somebody with a net. You have to wear nets when you're paddling.
Usually when you're paddling, you're moving enough. It's not too bad. The bugs. That one, the fellow was sitting on the porch of the cabin at Chimney Pond, and he was painting. He's passed on now, but he had over 50 covers for the Appalachian Mountain Club's magazine that he painted over the years. And he was a gentleman who had lost 2 fingers on one hand in an industrial accident. So he only had 2 fingers in his thumb. And then a few years after that, his wife's jealous ex-husband burst into their home with a firearm, intent on doing them harm, and he wrestled with them and stopped him, but the gun went off and shot him in the wrist, so he lost the use of his other hand. So he was a very talented artist with 2 fingers and a thumb, and he always wanted to climb Katahdin. He never had gotten up there. So my brother and I, we got him up to Chimney Pond, and we took him up the Cathedral Trail, and we kind of teased him afterwards, did you do any walking or working out at all before deciding to go up this mountain? And the Cathedral Trail, you have to use hands on some places because it's so steep, but between my brother tugging and me pushing, we got him up to the top of the mountain, and he fell to his knees and cried. He was so happy, but we got him up there. So that's who the fellow with the head net. I always take a head net. I've only had to use it a couple of times because when the bug dope breaks down, or we use thermocells now, these little devices that kill bugs in a certain radius, but they don't always work, so the head net's a great fallback position. It never leaves my day pack. Yes, ma'am.
Did I hear that the Appalachian Trail may be extended up into Atlantic Canada?
Yeah, it already is. It's called the International Appalachian Trail. And although Baxter doesn't acknowledge certain trails in the park that do that, but as soon as you get to the park boundary, the International Appalachian Trail, and it goes through the Katahdin Woods and Waters Monument, and there's lean-tos, and you can go all the way up to the Gaspé on it. Yep. Doesn't get a lot of use, but people have hiked the whole length of it. So, well, if no other questions, thanks for coming. Thanks for having me, and it's been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
And I got some books over here, and I'll sign some books if anybody would like one. Yep.
Thank you, Earl. That's
Okay.
great.
Yeah, great.
Wonderful.
Yep.
I did have one question.
Yes.
So, can you do one of these guided tours Is it really rustic? I am such a ninny. I like showers and I don't want
Yep.
outhouses.
Well, as Roxy says, she needs a Sherpa for some of these. When you go on these trips, the nice thing about, I love to go backpacking because you take what's in your pack, you cut the handle off your toothbrush, you do everything to lighten your load. When you go canoeing, you have a cooler just for ice for cocktails. You have camp chairs,
So
you
there's
have
different
tons of
types
tarps.
you can
You can have a certain level of comfort.
Okay.
And it all depends on how far you want to go in a day. Do you want to do 15-mile days or 10-mile days?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So how do you find out about, you hear that, Larry? You can do that.
Just don't believe the book when it says easy 25-minute quarter.
Yeah.
No,
The worst one is when they say sneak route river right, and it never is. Usually if you try to go down there without getting out and looking first. One of the things I do on trips is I often have the person with the least experience come in my boat, but because some of the bigger rapids you really need two paddlers that know what they're doing to keep from
yeah.
hitting rocks and stuff. So I probably have the record for the most swims on some of those rapids, and we always position people with safety ropes. And the last boat, I always like to bring up the rear because if anything happens, I can swoop
Fish
in,
out.
and the people in the front have the next amount of best experience. Always have ropes, so the first person down through then sets up in the eddy pool at the bottom of the rapids to pick up any people and stuff that may wash up in
Yeah.
when it goes down through. Hopefully it doesn't, but sometimes it does.